You are about to watch one of a series of workshops that ChurchWorks put on as part of our Accelerate Wellbeing Programme. Accelerate Wellbeing is supporting 6 innovative and highly impactful church-led wellbeing initiatives to scale and replicate to bring their incredible work to more people in more places across the UK. This involves exploring partnerships with other churches in new locations and opportunities to scale up the initiatives through commissioning by public sector bodies such as the NHS, the council or the police. These workshops, delivered throughout 2025, are part of the support we are offering our cohort as we invite brilliant speakers to cover topics from how churches can best engage in their local health system, how to grow well through good fundraising and governance, and how to maintain a Christian ethos in the process. The topics and speakers were just too good not to share, so we'll be releasing recordings of the workshops once monthly on our ChurchWorks YouTube. We won't share recordings of the interactive discussion between the cohort and the speaker after the presentation is finished, but we will share reflective questions at the end of each workshop to help you reflect on the content in your own context. We hope you enjoy the workshop, and please visit churchworks.org.uk and sign up to our newsletter to stay in touch.
Join us as well, so you're all very welcome to this workshop. Our speaker for today is Jon Kuhrt, who many of you will already know. And if you already know him, you'll know the workshop's going to be brilliant. Not to set expectations too high, but it definitely is. Jon and I first met, I think, in 2017, thereabouts, maybe 2018, 2017, I think, when Jon was Chief Exec of West London Mission, a homelessness charity in West London. This is fairly obvious. I was new to being the Chief Exec of a homelessness charity called Spitalfields Crypt Trust, not dissimilar to West London Mission, although in East London. And we had a number of really helpful conversations about how to maintain a Christian ethos within homelessness services, within dealing with HR matters, within working with your trustees, within the nuts and bolts of recruitment and genuine occupational requirements, and things like just putting Christian values and ethos up on the wall, on posters, all kinds of really interesting stuff. That stuck with me then and was really helpful. And I still put that stuff into practice and talk to others about it as well to pass it on, always crediting Jon when I do. So I'm sure this is going to be really, really helpful. The plan is that we hear from Jon until about 1:35 there or thereabouts. Have a little bit of time in breakout rooms to chat, see what's bubbling to the surface that we want to discuss further, and then back for some questions and answers towards the end. And we'll finish at 2:00. All right, so that's the plan. So welcome to those who are just joining us. I think so we make the best use of the time. It's over to you, please, Jon.
That's great, Steve. Thank you very much for your generous introduction, and it's really great to be with you all. This issue really, really excites me. As I'll explain, I think the last 20 years, it's been a really key part of the jobs I've had. And I think actually for quite a lot of that time, probably there's been a bit of a defensive posture to sort of defend the Christian ethos, as it were. I think we're actually in a really interesting moment in time, actually, now, where faith and spirituality are on the increase in terms of public conversation. So I think it's even more an issue that's relevant and good to talk about. And actually, as I'll be talking about how we can build confidence, I mean, my aim is by the end of today, I know you're all busy people, but there's more confidence and there's hopefully some models that you can put into practice in your environment. As Steve said, my context has been managing and running homelessness organisations. I know that's Paddy's context too, because we do work in the same city as the Light Project. But for others, you'll be doing different work, but I think this will be applicable in different ways. So I've got a presentation and obviously we'll make this available afterwards. So I hope this will be helpful. I'm just going to share that. And Alicia, is that all coming up okay? Great. Okay, brilliant. So I'm going to just run through some, just firstly, in terms of my experience and where I'm coming from. And I've just put up 5 employers that I've worked for. So back in the 90s, I worked for Centrepoint, which was a youth homeless charity. Does anyone on the call actually know who founded Centrepoint? If you do, unmute and give us the answer. Anyone know that? No, it doesn't matter. It's a guy called Ken Leach, Reverend Ken Leach, who's a vicar. He's quite well known for writing books on pastoral spirituality and social justice. And in the 1960s, he opened up the crypt in Soho and created the organisation Centrepoint. A lot of people just don't know that, because by the time I worked there, it had very little to do with the church. I went to the Shaftesbury Society, which is a large, far larger organisation. At the height I was there, employed about 2,000 people, running a lot of disability services. Founded in the name of Lord Shaftesbury, who was known as the poor man's Earl. So, evangelical social reformer, developed a Christian organisation. Actually, again, the whole Christian ethos was very contended, because we had tupied in a lot of people from local authorities who didn't necessarily join a Christian organisation at all, but found themselves part of it. I then went to the West London Mission, that's where I met Steve, and that was part of the Methodist Church based in the West End. Again, we employed about 100 people, so it was definitely a church-based organisation. But interestingly, a lot of the people we employed were not just ambivalent about the Christian faith, but actually quite antagonistic towards it. They hadn't had a great experience in their view, and the whole issue of faith was very contended. Lots of issues. And when I walked into that job in 2010, that was one of my key priorities, to actually address some of those things and turn the faith story into something that was positive rather than actually pretty negative. And from there, I was seconded to a very much not a Christian organisation. You may not view the government as a Christian organisation. So I was seconded to the government. It's the only time I've not worked for a charity. And for 4 years, I was a rough sleeping advisor in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. And the reason I mention it is because specifically my job was to do with advising local authorities on how to work with faith groups. So that's when I first met the Light Project in Peterborough, because Stephen, the chief exec, who many of you will know, who's living up at a garden party at Buckingham Palace as we speak, basically he got me involved because of issues with the local authority that they wanted to talk about. So I spent 4 years working with loads of local authorities around the country on how they related to faith groups, which 90% were Christian projects and churches, and sorting out a lot of the problems. And then about 2.5 years ago, I moved to Hope into Action, which is where I'm speaking from. And we're a Christian homeless charity. And the reason I refer to my experience there is because faith, if you could mute whoever that is, that would be great. But faith has basically been a big thread in all of these organizations, but in vastly different ways. So I don't want you to think that I'm sort of just stuck with one model. I'm in an organization now which is very overt about its faith. And as I'll say later on, I've gone there because it's more full fat. There's this sort of milk metaphor that Theos coined, that, faith can be skimmed, semi-skimmed. And I've kind of decided to go and work in the sort of full fat end because I find that really, really interesting. I've spent most of my life in the skimmed end of things, I'd say. But it's really interesting being a bit more blue top. Okay, so just going on to the overview of where we're going to go. As I said, I'll probably speak for, probably another 20 minutes or so. And I've got these 3 sort of sections, what I'll say. I want to talk about the secularizing trajectory. That's why I've put a strong current warning there. I think that unless you're investing in your Christian ethos, you're going to go in a secular direction. I think the whole issue of why we maintain a Christian ethos really needs to be tackled. And there'll be lots of views on that, what we mean by that. But I want to set out what I believe. I'm not a neutral person here. Hopefully my models can be applied in different ways, but I'm a real believer in maintaining a Christian ethos. So I want to be upfront about that. And then I want to give you a model of integration. And I hope that last bit is something that you could go away potentially and use or tweak or look at how it fits in your context. But here's a logo fest of organizations. Can anyone unmute and say what they've all got in common? Who do they work with, basically? Who do these organisations? Paddy, come on, you tell us. What's the client group?
They've all got a Christian basis or origin.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're working in the homelessness sector generally.
Yeah, you've done both my questions in one there. Thanks, Paddy. You're so clued up.
I've seen this slide a couple of times, so I'm cheating a little bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry that you're I'm preaching to the choir. But basically, yeah, they're all homelessness organisations. I could have put up about 5 times more of these loads. There's so many examples of large organisations like Shelter, Centrepoint, YMCA, Salvation Army, large national organisations. A lot of people don't know that Shelter was set up by a URC church minister, or that actually that you've got organisations locally in so many different ways, like Spitalfields Crypt Trust, where Steve used to be, and they've all got, some are obvious, like the Church Army and Salvation Army, but a lot of the faith footprint is hidden within homelessness in history. As I said, a lot of people wouldn't know that Centrepoint was started by a vicar. And a lot of these organisations, they're in a real range of places now. Obviously, YMCAs are interesting because they're all separate charities. Some are strongly Christian, really strongly kind of, they will talk about Jesus a lot. Others actually are far, far more secular. The one local to me in South London is now called Evolve. It's the first organisation to split from the YMCA movement, and it's very much secular. And someone who worked for YMCA said to me, yeah, we had to, the name's difficult because we don't just work with young people, we don't just work with men, we're not Christian. The A is the only bit that's relevant. So, that is going on all of the time, these conversations. And I think that behind the secularizing tendency, there's a whole load of different factors. I mean, you can have this kind of thing where, we started out with a real desire to connect to the Christian faith, but now we just meet needs as best we can. Faith becomes faded for different reasons. You can have a concern about, a lot of our individual donors are church people, but our funders, and especially the council, wouldn't like it if we appeared too Christian. It could be fearful. This one, we still have the vicar as a trustee, but we have little to do with the church anymore. Sort of fossilized, basically, sort of stuck with a historic view. And then lastly, I think I've heard this quite a lot, and especially perhaps from people who've had difficult experiences of faith. We don't need to ram the gospel down people's throats and Bible bash. Why don't we just try and love them? And I think, there's a sort of polarity that can come out with those kind of statements, often perhaps rooted in real examples where people have been coercive. And I think behind all of these issues, there's often a sort of theological lack of confidence. I see it right from the start when a church-based project gets funding. And it may start off with a real strong Christian ethos, but they go to partnership meetings, they're outside the church bubble, and suddenly their confidence dries up. And, it's a sort of theological confidence or a missional confidence. People, I especially see some vicars who are really barnstorming from the pulpit and then going to a meeting with the council and don't mention faith at all. And I think that's a real issue because I think a lot of organisations like the ones I listed have started off with a missional drive. And that needs to be rekindled and found, and a confidence not just to express faith in sort of church settings, but most of all in partnership settings. As I said, this report that Theos did back in 2015, I think is really brilliant. Paul Bickley is a really thoughtful writer, and he coined this sort of milk-based metaphor. And what I like about it is that it's not pejorative. That, this is a preference that you each have. Skimmed milk isn't worse than full fat. It's a choice. And you in your context may choose that you need an ethos that is more low key because that's what works in your context and where you want to go. As I've said, I want to work in a full fat organization. That's why I've gone to Hope into Action. And I'll say it later, our model is very integrated with the church. It's not just a case of using a few Bible verses in our literature. Our operating model is dependent on partnering with the church. So there's a real integration there. But the important thing, I think, is that we're intentional. So the intentionality is what I really want to express, with that issue of the current taking you in a secular direction. I think unless you're intentional, you'll probably slide maybe from a full fat to half fat and eventually low fat. But as I'll show you later on, I think so often it then drops off the agenda. It goes with the sort of commitments of the person leading the organization. It's not embedded enough. It's not talked about enough. And so it's vulnerable. So I strongly believe there's a sort of secularizing tendency and a trajectory. And I want to go on secondly here to about why maintain a Christian ethos. And I've got these three kind of reasons. The booklet that I'm sharing there is a booklet I actually wrote about 20 years ago called Integrated Faith. And it was when I was at the Shaftesbury Society. And I think it just shows how, that there's a disintegrating tendency that happens. And we were really needing to articulate within a very mixed environment that faith can work in a mixed community. And these three reasons I've thought of, in terms of practicalities, I think that maintaining a connection with the founding ethos often helps you be the organization you're set up to be. When I was at the West London Mission, we've got a name like Mission. We need to unpack what that means. It's not just a relic from history. What makes us a mission as opposed to an organization? And there's so much resources in that Methodist history to draw out that connects to supporters and people who want to support the organization because they've known about it for years. So, it's church-based, so you want a good integration with the body that started it up in the first place. So many organizations go through times of tension with the church that founded them, and then there's a divorce, and it's messy often. Local to me, a preschool that was set up by a church in South London recently got evicted from the premises because this disintegration happened between the church and the preschool. It was a nightmare because you had kids protesting with placards saying, Jesus wouldn't kick us out, and all of this kind of thing. And it's all rooted in a disconnection between the church and the social action project that it set up. So that's practical, a load of practical reasons. I think secondly, theological. I really believe as a Christian that social action represents God's concerns for poverty, for injustice, that his ultimate purposes of renewal and redemption are reflected in the projects that have been set up in his name. And I have a real, integrated ambition that those things can be held together, that you can still be professional, that you can still maintain really good practice in terms of the social action you're doing, but do it rooted in your belief in God. And I think, as I say, in the Bible, God's ultimate purposes of bringing about a new heavens and a new earth that's full of justice, where there won't be any more pain, there won't be any more suffering. These are the things we're working towards. And I feel that at times when you get a split between the church and the social action, both sides are diminished by it. The church needs its social action projects, but the social action projects need the church as well. They need the support, spiritual sustenance. I think they need to be integrated as well as possible. And thirdly, and I think probably the strongest reason I want to spend a bit of time with now, is that it's so relevant to the needs we're trying to meet. Faith, it's really on the agenda these days. People are talking about sort of, Justin Briley's got this podcast about the surprising rebirth of faith in God. And I think there are indications that faith is so much more on the agenda than it was in recent years. And certainly that's true in homelessness. The homelessness field is far less secular than it was 20 years ago, in my view. I want to give an example here, that this report came out in 2013 called Lost and Found. And it's a report that interviewed lots of homeless people, 75 different homeless people in London. And its findings are really interesting. For a start, it highlights the way that the homeless sector has become very secular. And it said in page 20 here, it says, faith and spirituality is a dimension of life that's largely ignored within the philosophy of mainstream service provision, regarded as irrelevant, or as a private matter best avoided, and even perceived by some in the sector with suspicion and outright hostility. And I think that's definitely true, that I've seen faith only referred to negatively often, even in organizations where the majority of the donors are Christians and a lot of the supporters come from the church. I think that's things were regarded as irrelevant or as a private matter best avoided. And this report really challenges that. And the really interesting thing is the report is written by an atheist. It's not written from a committed Christian. It's written by someone who was an atheist, but who was really interested in why people aren't talking about faith. And when he interviewed all these homeless people, he says, actually, he concludes with a whole load of relevant guidance for the sector. But he says this, that for homeless people, religious belief, practice, and doctrine can help them come to terms with the past, often characterized by profound emotional and material loss. It can enhance and give structure to the present, where time hangs heavy for many, and create a purposeful future built on hope, fellowship, and a sense of purpose. And for me, this report coming out 12 years ago was absolutely a key moment, because it was independent evidence, not just that Christian work was important, and it's good to have reports that cheerlead and say, well done, the church. But this is far deeper than that, because it's going directly to the people we're seeking to help and saying faith and spirituality are really relevant, because it's not just a case of material needs being met. Homelessness is not just houselessness. People don't just need a sort of mechanical response. They need he says in this report that, some people just think it's an equation, a flat, a bit of support and a bit of CBT, and Bob's your uncle, you're sorted out. Whereas, of course, people aren't like that. People need, real sense of purpose. That there's a meaning behind their life, and this is profoundly spiritual, especially people coping with issues of forgiveness and forgiving others, finding a meaning and a direction in life. So I think it's really key, and for me, this is really lived out in reality in the experiences I've had. And I just wanted to show you this picture. This is Hope into Action. This is the baptism of one of our tenants last year. And he's the guy covering his face there with the tattoos. And for me, this photo embodies the reason why I believe in a Christian ethos. Because this guy has been homeless. The church has helped house him, has met his material needs. That's the sort of overt social action bit of it. He's combated his houselessness. But he's been welcomed into a church community. He's got new relationships. He's surrounded by people of all ages, clapping him, affirming him, celebrating that decision he's taken. So it's resources, yes, with a house, relationships in community. And thirdly, he's taken on a new identity in Christ. And that's what baptism is. So it's resources, relationships, and identity. And I find this is the holistic response that actually we shouldn't cut ourselves off from. Hope into Action, I love being somewhere where the flow between the practical and the spiritual is opened up wide. And of course, there's plenty of complications. Loads of our tenants won't go for baptism and stuff, and we're helping them just the same. But it's wonderful to see when it can happen. And we measure the stats, and this is from our impact report last year. So, we had 55% of our tenants engage in a church service or go on a Christian course like Alpha or something like that. And 69% wanted to be prayed for. And 16 made a commitment like this tenant did of baptism. And 19, it's important to say, are engaging with other faiths. We house especially a lot of Muslim refugees. And of course, they've got their own faith journey. They've got their own commitments, which often, we find really interesting to talk about and have good dialogue with them. I mean, in terms of, we use these two terms, spiritual passion and professional excellence. And I've just done a workshop with a team this morning, and I was saying how this kind of model is actually not how we like to see things, not just balancing two things. We've got to be professional over here, and then we can do some spiritual stuff over there. Rather than something like that, we like to picture it more like this, that basically the spiritual passion, and we deliberately use the word passion because we want to keep that really stoked up, like not just a sort of ethos, but a passion, is at the heart of what we're doing. It's like a heartbeat. It's pumping good things around the wider body. So the spiritual passion needs to be integrated with the professional excellence. That's what we're seeking to do. And those words in red are our values. So that's, for me, a little bit linked to the model I'm just going to show. But, I think some of you may have watched a film about Susie before coming. For me, she embodies the fact that, yes, we've housed her. We've done a whole load of those things to do with those red words, employ their values. But there's such a fruit of her spirituality, of her link with the church, because, she's not just being served, but she's now part of a community. She's able to articulate that. So for me, it's really empowering because she's now a giver. She's giving out to other people. And similar to Susie, this is a guy, Antonio, who's a former heroin addict like Susie, actually. And he said to me that, I didn't know I could be loved by God because I turned into not a nice person. I came to a realization, all the madness, that she's surely not my worth. Surely I must be destined for something a little better than sleeping rough and injecting drugs. And he says, after rehab, he says, it was like putting together a jigsaw, and I think Jesus was the missing piece. And, again, probably this is best illustrated with people like Susie or Antonio, for whom this has made sense, this joining up. It's not just a separate thing. It's integrated with their recovery journeys, integrated with them coming out of homelessness. So that's my first two bits. I'm coming into land on my last bit now. I want to share a sort of model of integration. And I've reflected a lot on this, and especially in very, very mixed environments where I'm working. And I think one of the clues to this model and getting this right is to affirm that faith can be expressed legitimately in implicit ways and explicit ways. So that theory of implicit and explicit is really fundamental to the model I'm going to share. And I think the relationship between the two is absolutely fundamental. What I think we need to aim for if we're integrating faith is that there isn't an argument between the implicit camp and the explicit camp. We've got to have a synthesis, a combination, a sort of mutuality between the two. And hopefully this will make sense as I talk about it. So, explicit, we're talking about where God and Jesus are explicitly named, whether in prayer, worship, liturgy, or other ways, and service users or clients or whatever you call them are encouraged or connected in with those activities. Implicit, I think, is where Christian beliefs underpin, inspire, or inform a service, but it may not be explicitly named. And they'll emphasize, that the ethos is expressed through care, hospitality, inclusivity, social justice, or any number of other words. And I think, looking at this model, say you think you could put your name of your project in that top section there. I have used this model with hundreds of people coming to training that we used to do. And I think if you look around the outside here, this is the social impact. We all probably want to have a social impact to what we do. Things like good practice, inclusivity, social justice, commitment to our users, being professional, values, quality of care, love and acceptance. All these things can be expressed by people who aren't Christians or people of other faiths. And I think the Christian faith is often working implicitly through those things. And you've got stories like the Good Samaritan. There's a theological basis for implicit faith. The Good Samaritan isn't recorded as saying anything in terms of his beliefs, but he acted. He did something to make a difference. And I think the external bodies, regulators, funders, other charities, local councils, are fundamentally interested in how you do those outside things, those social impact things. And having worked with countless local authorities, I find them incredibly pragmatic. I mean, I worked with local authorities for 4 years. I hardly met any hardcore atheists who were saying, these pesky Christians, we've got to shut them down. I never heard that. I just heard really stretched, overworked council people saying, well, I don't really understand what they believe, but they're doing a good job and I want them to carry on. One local authority phoned me up and said, there's this team locally doing really good work. They do talk about Jesus quite a lot. Is that okay? And I said, well, they've been coercive. And they went, no, not at all. They're great. They just talk about Jesus a lot. I said, well, that's why they're doing it. They are a church. And I think in the middle of this diagram, I think this is the Christian spirituality that, again, is like the heartbeat, where faith is explicit, where there is prayer, there's theology, there's an ethos, there's a relationship with church. And I think it's that heartbeat that I want to encourage you to think about how that is pumping good things around the body. It's not the whole body. It's the heart. We still need our hands and our feet and all that, but the heart is doing something. Now, this is what tends to happen in organizations, that the pressure of doing these things around the outside, because it's hard work, tend to squeeze this ethos. And this is my experience over the last 20 odd years, until eventually it's pushed out. It's pushed out to history. It's maybe pushed out to a prayer at the start of a trustees meeting, but it's not integrated. And you have a heart transplant, essentially. And, good practice, regulation, funding basically replace the thing that set up the whole thing in the first place. And, as I've said there, it can be a historic fact, but it's disintegrated from the working model. And I've seen this time and time and time and time again in big organizations and small organizations. And as I said, I believe it's tragic. Now, if we go to the other extreme, this is to be avoided as well, I think, where basically when the local council or funders look, all they see is your explicit faith. And actually good practice is being marginalized, and I've seen that again. I've seen some quite embarrassing things where Christian groups are addressing the council with just loads of sort of Christianese that they don't understand, going on about their vision and what God's telling them, and the council can't work out what they're going on about. And so I'm not arguing for that either, but I am arguing for this. And for each of you, there'll be a different size of that inner circle. Do you want a big inner circle? Do you want a full fat kind of thing? Or do you want a lower fat? But, I would avoid it just shrinking and shrinking. So I'm going to land up on sort of 5 take-homes now, because my time is up. So I think these are the things that I'd recommend, and maybe these are the kind of things we can discuss more. I believe conviction is really vital. A strong personal faith in leadership is, I think, essential if you're going to maintain a Christian ethos. But it's not just a spiritual commitment. It's a commitment that faith is relevant to the needs of the people you're serving. And that's the most important thing. It's not just something for fundraising or something for church. Faith is relevant to the people you're working with. Secondly, I think clarity is really important. And this, again, where Christians can let themselves down with things that aren't clear, especially in recruitment and employment. If you can't express your position with confidence and clarity, then it's not going to work. And I think that's really important. You have to go the hard yards on this stuff and really, test what you really believe and be clear. I think connection, I think integration is really important. I believe the Christian faith can underpin the best practice of being empowering and of, really working in a way that is recognized as good practice in the realm you're working in. And I really believe there should be a zero tolerance on hidden agendas or coercive practices. We've got to be miles away from that stuff. There's no need for the gospel to be smuggled in ways. We've got to be open and transparent about what it means. Fourthly, creativity. I think, I do quite a lot of youth work, and I've seen some God slots being pretty cringy. And I think, again, in homelessness work, things have at times been quite clumsy. I think, there are creative ways that we can really connect it in with people's deepest desires. I think the time spent in that implicit domain is really important. So you can see the opportunities where faith can be made explicit. And lastly, the theologian Leslie Newbigin's really inspired me, and he wrote a book called Proper Confidence. And I think confidence in the gospel is the key thing, actually really believing this stuff and believing in its relevance, so that we can face down opposition gently but assertively. And I found that some of the opposition, the secular opposition, is incredibly weak and not thought through, and actually crumbles when you give good evidence as to why it's important.